John Whitman. I am the worldwide director for what IBM calls Safer Planet. Safer Planet is a set of offerings, much better set of offerings that we bring to market for our customers that I like to say help us find and catch bad guys. And that's really at the core of what our mission is. And that's what my team does on a worldwide basis. I spent probably about 10 years working at IBM Federal. And this was my core customer set for a long time. So I'm very pleased to be here today. We have two panelists with us who I think will be quite interesting. We'll walk through, they each have a couple different slides they'd like to share about their background and what they're doing for their agencies. And then we'll have some questions, and hopefully we'll have time to open it up for some Q&A. So think about some good questions here to ask. Today we have with us Vijay D'Souza. Vijay is with Government Accountability Office, and he's the Director of Enhanced Analytics. And we also have with us Kern. Ken Kern is with the New York County District Attorney's Office, which is where Manhattan is part of. And he's the Chief of Staff for the Investigation Division. We're going to turn it over first to Vijay. He's got a couple things that he's going to walk through. Then Ken will do the same thing, and then we'll get more into the panel. Thank you.
Turn on this mic or just use this one? Okay. Hi everyone, and it's good to be here. My name is Vijay D'Souza. I'm a director with the Government Accountability Office. We've established a new center called the Center for Enhanced Analytics. The center is probably only a couple months old, but what I was going to do is just touch briefly on what GAO does. GAO itself is much older than that. We were founded in 1921. We are part of the legislative branch, which is something people don't always realize. And we do performance and financial audits of all federal agencies and various entities that receive federal funds. Most of our work is done through requests from Congress or mandates that are written into legislation. And in fiscal year 2015 alone, we were responsible for about $75 billion in savings for the federal government. So we're very proud of that number. GAO has about 3,000 employees, most of which are in headquarters, but we do have 11 field offices. And I just wanted to touch briefly on how we handle analytics. There we go. So GAO is divided into several mission teams, and each team focuses on a particular agency or issue area. So, for example, we have one team that focuses on homeland security issues and another one that focuses on international affairs. I'm in the colored wedge in the lower corner there, which is called Applied Research and Methods, and we basically function as a central analytics organization. We're sort of a consultative organization to the rest of GAO. And the different mission teams will come to us with different analytic challenges or problems they're hoping to solve, and we provide support to them. Within our group, we have several specialists. We have roughly about 120 people. And we have people with a variety of quantitative backgrounds, including statisticians, data analysts, economists, computer scientists, and others. Obviously, analytics is a key part of all the work we do, and we're trying to make several efforts to improve our capabilities in this area. One thing I wanted to mention in that effort is we're planning a forum on advanced analytics later this year, where we're interviewing experts in government and in different companies and academia to try to gather information on advanced analytic techniques specific to identifying and reducing fraud and improper payments. We hope to publish the results of this work sometime early next year, so stay tuned for that, and hopefully it will be useful to you. Now, I did want to touch briefly on some of the large data sets we use, just to give you an idea of some of the scope of our work and some of the challenges we do face. Specifically for fraud, some of the sets we use is we use the death records from Social Security, and I just mentioned that because in most of the analyses we do, if we match against these records, it's amazing how many people who are no longer with us manage to cash their checks. We also make extensive use of data from CMS for federal healthcare programs. We look at both at individual claims, and we look at aggregate information to look at overall program effectiveness. And obviously those are very large data sets and can sometimes be quite challenging to use. The federal procurement data system also contains aggregated contracting information for the federal government, and this is also a useful source of analytic information for oversight, both for compliance and also to evaluate best practices in procurement. And then every audit we do, there'll be a unique specialized data set with its own formatting and quality issues and interests. And so every audit we do is slightly different and has unique challenges related to analytics. Since we are focused on fraud, I did want to touch briefly on our fraud risk management framework, which was released last July. This framework, which this is just a very high-level graphic, is basically an approach that we're encouraging agencies to take to really take a more strategic approach to identifying and reducing fraud and improper payments. The idea is pretty straightforward. It's sort of a life cycle approach, but the reason I put it up is we view analytics as a key component of this. That is, agencies should identify appropriate analytic tools to identify fraud and improper payments, try to implement those tools, and evaluate their effectiveness, and then kind of refine and improve them. And we view this as an important step towards reducing the very large amount of improper payments that the federal government makes. There's pending legislation which is actually looking to kind of require that agencies use this framework, but it is out there for use now. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is this isn't a very fancy slide, but I'll call this my data analytics iceberg, which is basically, you hear a lot of talk about analytics and all the potential it has, but the important thing to remember is most of the work is not the actual analytics itself, it's everything you do to get to the analytics. Most of the problems we face in doing analytics is really just getting the data from the agencies, understanding the quality issues with it, making sure that we have appropriate expertise and developing models that can withstand scrutiny. And after we've done all of that, then we can actually do the analytics and report out on it. So I just want to emphasize that that's often the bigger challenge than the analytics, the specific analytic approach itself. And with that, I'll wrap it up, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions in the discussion today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kern. I serve as the Chief of Staff of the Investigation Division at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of our District Attorney, Cyrus R. Vance, Jr. I just want to thank IBM for the opportunity to talk with you today, and I look very much forward to the conversation that we'll have. John mentioned at the very beginning that part of the goal is to catch bad guys. Ultimately, that's my role as a prosecutor within our office. My office in Manhattan has 1,400 employees, 600 prosecutors. About 105,000 cases come in or are created by our office. And what I'd like to emphasize in my brief talk this morning with you is that the trend that we've made as an office using analytics has been a move away from cases that walk into the door as opposed to being created. So just very briefly, in terms of structure of our office, like many law enforcement agencies, we are a soup to nuts spot. We handle crime that happens and is brought in by the New York Police Department in our trial division. Our second column is our investigation division, which does long-term investigative work, and then our third column is our appeals. You'll notice in our investigation division a series of subunits, about 7 different bureaus or units that handle the wide range of financial fraud. Our office, as I mentioned, does everything from a basic fraud, somebody cashing a Social Security check that doesn't belong to them, or that they shouldn't be properly checking, to counterterrorism work. One of the 7 bureaus or units that we have within the investigation division is the cybercrime and identity theft unit. Just briefly, what I want to highlight here is that when I started in the office 12 years ago, cybercrime and identity theft were a very small portion of the inventory that was coming in the door. That's radically changed. 25% of all of our felony complaints now involves either an ID theft or a cybercrime component. That's a radical change. It's forced us to change our structure, how we train our prosecutors, how we train our investigators, and how we use analytics. Who recognizes this? Imagine a gong going off. So the old model is one in which police officers make an arrest, a prosecutor receives that and takes that through the grand jury process, trial phase, and then ultimately there's hopefully a conviction or an acquittal when appropriate. That's the old school method. The model really has changed for our office and is changing for offices around the country, both at the state level as well as the federal level. The new model is one of being proactive in terms of case development and investigation development. So our district attorney, when he came into office in 2010, having previously served as a prosecutor, his first job after law school, he said, do we sit on our hands waiting for crime to tick up, or do we do something to drive crime lower? And the key thing about this was, in any prosecutor's office, in any police agency, any law enforcement agency, you can imagine each desk filled with what are called red wells, folders. I have a case as a prosecutor. The woman sitting next to me has a case. I don't know what's in her folder. She doesn't know what's in mine unless we have a random conversation about it. With 105,000 cases coming into our door in the island of Manhattan alone, that model had to change. The documents had to start talking to each other in order for us to be able to figure out how to really drive crime down. And there's been great success at some levels, and there are still challenges that have to be addressed. So what the office now does is focus on specialized units that are looking at open source records, investigative data, internal databases to make connections between various types of leads. It was described in a New York Times article about our office as the Moneyball Approach. How do you, the same method that the Oakland A's use, how do we as an office use our money wisely to try to interconnect data? When I talk about data, please understand I'm not just talking about the files on an individual prosecutor's desks. There's another file that exists for the cop who made the arrest. Financial institutions throughout New York City or retail shops that get hit with all sorts of crimes. All that data needed to be received properly, either voluntarily or under a subpoena, and then aggregated to better understand how to do it. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples of how it's actually led to some developments for our office. Our crime strategies unit was created strictly to focus on how to drive down gang crime. And that was really a huge problem for Manhattan. And we would take data that was existing across New York City, put police officers, prosecutors, and community outreach people together with that data to try to drive down gang crimes. Last week, we arrested 120 different gang members. It's just a series of these. Cybercrime Intelligence Unit, same model. You have to have highly skilled individuals and analysts who are in the dark web, pulling information out, interacting with criminals, not taking a passive approach, but actually gleaning data, analyzing it, and figuring out how to pursue those individual cyber criminals, but also then how to make connections. In this space, our international partnerships are critical. Our federal partners, as well as our international ones. Cybercrime is all about money movement and attacks, and if you're not thinking globally in terms of your investigative strategy, you're going to be, you may be successful, but you're just going to be knocking out the easy criminals, and you're not taking down the sophisticated networks. Couple of last points: financial crimes, financial intelligence unit, same idea, focused on bank data. International money movement, focused on illicit transfers across continents. Our counterterrorism work, putting together information that is gleaned from Paris, Brussels, New York, London, Spain, and making sure that's all put together. So we were talking very briefly before the session started about how difficult it is for the public sector, given the data analytics individuals are often difficult to bring into the public sector, not because they don't have a vocation for do it, but because frankly it just costs a lot to bring that level of talent in. So you have to think creatively, and part of that is leveraging nonprofit organizations that can often serve as a place to integrate data. Global Cyber Alliance is one example. Created last September 2015 with partners in London, Paris. The idea is to take attack data in the cyber community, non-PII information, but attack data, and make sure that it's put into a common pool so that while a sector, a financial sector, may be talking to its members, they may not necessarily be talking to the energy sector that's also getting hit, or the education center that's getting hit. Strikingly, from an education standpoint, there are several of the universities receive up to 100,000 attacks every day, and that data may not necessarily be being shared with other sectors. Global Cyber Alliance is an attempt to change that model. As of now, 160 different entities have joined across 14 countries and 19 sectors. Information about it can be found at globalcyberalliance.org. So I'll end with this, and thank you for your attention. For law enforcement, our primary goals are obviously stopping the fraud, stopping the bleeding, catching perpetrators, and then preventing future criminal activity. Three questions that we generally have as we approach the marketplace is the following as it relates to data analytics. What are the data points that your institution has? What's the retention policy related to that data? And who are the best individuals to discuss that data with so that we're able to marry the data and marry the talent behind that data to make the connections. So I thank you again, John, for your time, for the opportunity to speak here, and I look forward to any conversation that we have.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Vijay. I wanted to pull at actually something that Vijay brought up during his segment there. He talked about people receiving benefits sometimes after they've passed. In 2013, Social Security paid out $133 million to beneficiaries who were deceased. And the Federal Employee Retirement System paid out $400 million to retirees that were deceased. It's quite a lot of money in 1 year. So what do you think the federal government and state and local governments are doing to address this problem, and how are analytics playing a role in that?
I think a good example of that is Treasury is standing up the Do Not Pay Center, and that's a very important effort to try to integrate a variety of data sources of people and entities that shouldn't receive payments, and try to stop the payment before it goes out, because obviously it's a lot easier to do that than try to recover the payment after it's gone. But there's a lot of challenges in doing that, and then I think it also has to be balanced with the expectation that people have that they should receive their benefits in a timely manner. So it's definitely a balancing act using analytics appropriately.
I think for us, what we often find is that generally somebody who's cashing a check that doesn't belong to them. Obviously, there's a long history behind that. And what we want to do is, one, make sure that we're addressing it and not letting it go unaddressed in the criminal justice system, making sure that there's restitution back, but also figuring out a way in which, as we're sharing that information outside of our one spot, so that an individual like this, who may be a first-time offender, we're chasing down any other criminal activity that he or she may be engaged in, credit card fraud, identity theft, other scams. What we generally find in this example is that they're not one-offs, that there are other crimes behind it, benefits-related fraud, EBT fraud, things like this.
That's actually a great point. And one of the things that we see, criminals have a history of repeating their behavior. We talk about eligibility monitoring and how do we prevent these issues from occurring and identifying these people. In 2011, there was a woman in Michigan who won the lottery. And even after winning the lottery, she continued receiving food stamps for 6 months additionally afterwards. The question is how does analytics help address what we would call continuously vetting people or trying to understand where that potential repeat offender is before it starts to happen? And how do you think analytics plays a role in that in your organizations?
So obviously we're not doing the programmatic work ourselves. We're an oversight organization. But part of the idea with our fraud framework is to encourage the programmatic portions of federal agencies and not just the IGs to implement appropriate use of tools like this to where you kind of check things on a continuing basis and you try to integrate data sources. So I think there's a lot of potential there to do things in a more timely manner. One of the issues is, the lag in some of the data sources. I think in the prior session I just sat in for a few minutes, the speaker from CMS mentioned, there's quite a long time delay for healthcare claims before you can actually access and view them, and that's true of a lot of other large federal data sets. So things that we can do to reduce the time frame to make data available for eligibility determination, I think is really important.
So that's obviously a tremendous frustration to see somebody who's hit a lottery to then be enjoying the public dole at the expense of other individuals who need those dollars and scarce dollars. I think the challenge is, I know when you look across the state system, how one state's agencies, New York State has tens of agencies. The lottery space is different from a prosecution space. How are they talking to each other? How are they sharing data? And how are they ensuring that they're abiding by and committed to the privacy requirements? Our district attorney is, somebody who is highly sensitive and appropriately so, that any data that comes into the office always has to come in through the legal way. It's just a basic requirement. It's way our folks are trained. So, the challenge is, how do you share data while also making sure that you're not violating privacy requirements? So these are real tensions that exist at the federal level, the state level, and interacting with our private sector friends.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point. Actually, I think, I'm seeing it now on a worldwide basis, privacy concerns in areas where countries didn't have to be as much concerned about privacy. But as we become a global economy, it's becoming more important to citizens throughout the globe. We talked about, Vijay, you mentioned GAO. They're about oversight. And, the first two questions were really about purposeful fraud. But what we see a lot sometimes is, overlap or inefficiencies, right? Organizations who are potentially giving the same benefit to the same person two different ways, or a lot of fragmentation. And it's estimated that billions of dollars in what some people might term as waste is out there in the federal government and in the state and local governments. I know you talked a bit about data integration, and that's really key. But do you think the government has the right analytics to be able to act on that? And do you think that it is the responsibility, or whose responsibility would it be to ensure that the data integration takes place efficiently?
Well, I mean, I think it's a pretty broad issue. It's funny, the example that came to my mind when you were talking about this was a very, very specific issue, but I'll just use it as an example. You know, a lot of agencies don't actually have good track of the software they purchase, and there is some recent OMB guidance about trying to direct agencies to try to consolidate their purchases. So if, you know, 25 different agency components are purchasing software from IBM, why don't they all purchase it together? Well, just doing that is actually, probably the people here from the agencies can talk more about how difficult that is than I can, but even I can say within our own agency, just trying to consolidate something like a list of vendors to figure out how you can get the best price is a challenge. And so I guess that goes back to kind of the point I was making with that slide is, you know, having the quality of the data and consistent data sources and stuff in place is really important to reduce duplication and fragmentation. Even something as simple, one of the biggest problems in fraud is matching names. You know, one data system may have the whole name as one field, and another one may have the last name and the first name. So matching names is a huge project just in and among itself.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that it's compounded by the criminals who are, when I look at a rap sheet of somebody who is involved in identity theft or some sort of financial fraud at either the state or a federal benefit, we're talking about skilled, generally some fairly skilled actors who are interposing names, switching dates of birth up, complicating our lives, and trying to make sure that we're able to get past that fog so that we're, you know, one, we're exonerating those who should be exonerated and not involved in any criminal activity, but then targeting those who are actually perpetrating it. So, you know, it's a real challenge. And when you think of 95% of all criminal investigation and prosecution happens at the state level, 95%. So you're talking about many agencies at the prosecutorial and investigative area who are challenged for resources. Having high-end data analytics for my office is a luxury. We are blessed to have that amount of data analytics available to us. I lived in Texas 11 years, lived in West Texas for many of them. Town of 15,000 people. There's no way there's data analytics happening at that prosecutor's office, or it's just you can't misuse the dollars that way. But as identity theft and fraud are becoming a rising tide, the need for the data analytics is expanding. So it's a real challenge, John.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up. I'll say that it's a bit of a data quality issue, data integration issue, but just the sheer ability to match data across many different systems of record becomes a big challenge for many organizations, both state and local. And then you bring in other sources of information that might not be systems of record. I mean, there's the open source, right? What's on the web, what's on the dark web, things that you can get out there in the wild, as we like to say. And so this kind of is a question around balancing the need for security against balancing the need for privacy. So, you know, if we're going to really try to do identity validation and ensure that the data is being integrated well enough with all the sophistication of the analytics today, how do we balance that need for comprehensive security while protecting the citizens' rights and their privacy?
Well, you're talking about a debate that's happening in the United States and worldwide right now across every level. And we as citizens and practitioners in the field are at the forefront of this balance. And you know, there's no way that I have any greater answer or response to this challenge. But what I would say is I think a certain degree of public awareness is just, as we see evolutions in things like smartphone usage, the digitalization of our lives, and what that means for how we address public safety and balance those things. The public is needing appropriate amount of time to make the decisions. They're legislators. This is all part of a rich debate, whether it's in San Bernardino, California, whether it's across the seas in Paris. We're all engaged in the same debate. Mm-hmm. And for us in law enforcement, the key is to be vigilant that we never lose the public's trust that we're misusing information in our quest to protect public safety. And it's a real challenge in the climate right now. It's something that there's a need for great integration of all this data, but such distrust that government is going to misuse it. And that goes to, we're all wrapped, if you're in government and you're touching data, it's a real challenge. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you just have to continuously be forthcoming and as transparent as you can, that you're using the data and receiving the data appropriately.
Yeah, obviously GAO sponsored a series of meetings, I think a couple years ago now, about data sharing. And this was, the privacy issue and the legal implications around that were continually raised as probably the number one or number two challenge for this area. There's legislation, the Computer Matching Act, that governs the ability of federal agencies to share data. There have been some changes to it. I'm not an expert on it, but I know there have been some tweaks made to it. But I think the issue is a lot of this legislation was written before we had the ideas of how we might share the information now. And so I think it is a huge challenge. It's something we need to balance. But I also think that the types of problems that federal agencies are trying to solve are fairly similar from agency to agency. And one of the things we find, hopefully as we go forward, we won't have to reinvent the wheel each time as we negotiate solutions or agreements on how to share information. I think the ability to kind of share those best practices across the government is going to be important so that you don't have to negotiate a separate legal agreement from scratch every time you look at a new data set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that you mentioned San Bernardino. This was near and dear to everybody's heart, that in your professional life you may actually be in favor of trying to break that iPhone open, and in your personal life you say, wait a minute, this is my iPhone. It's my personal message to my wife or my daughter or whatever, and that's nobody else's business. And what I find interesting is that while we couldn't settle this in a debate, in a court of law or a debate through policy, at the end of the day, the problem was resolved by, in essence, hacking into the phone. Right? And an agency went out and bought some software, and were able to crack that phone. And I think as we deal with cybercrime and hacking, they're going to be more sophisticated as this continues. If you've been following the news, immediately after the Brussels attack, one of the major chat services, WhatsApp, had said, now we're going to be encrypted all the way through the process. We're encrypted at the phone of the sender, we're encrypted on the server, we're encrypted at the end user, and we're encrypted all the way through, which makes it even more difficult to access. But the hackers always seem to be a step ahead of us. Not only from a fraud, but from an actual attack or something that might be terrorism related. And so given the anonymity of the internet and all the encryption that's in place today, this is really an attribution perspective. How good do you think we are at finding out where these attacks might be coming from? And more importantly, what's being done to partner between public and private sector to try to overcome these issues?
So I actually think in terms of attribution, we're, from a law enforcement side, from 5 years ago, we're at a much more sophisticated place. We have much better international relations to figure out ultimately the end goal is, if I'm standing before a jury and I've done an investigation, I have to show that this individual was the one behind the computer. The attribution issue, how do I know this is the individual or group of individuals that were behind it? I actually think we've made great strides there. Part of it is the investment in terms of cyber, the investment in terms of skill, and just the need. If we saw an upsurge in mob-related activity, we would devote resources there. What we're seeing an uptick in is cyber-related fraud and identity theft. We've put resources there. The second part of your question is, I think, a really good one. How are we linking all the different sectors that exist out there? We've had conversations with, as an office with different sectors. Financial institution A has been attacked, and they've addressed it. They've had that data. Financial institution B down the block in New York has also been attacked. They may or may not be sharing that information within the sector. Mm-hmm. Imagine, how the other sectors that are less sophisticated than the financial industry, probably the most sophisticated in terms of cyber-related activity, are integrating. And then how are they integrating the public sector? So, Global Cyber Alliance, National Cyber Forensic Training Center, all these nonprofits serve huge, valuable roles. One, because frankly, nonprofits tend to be more trusted right now as repositories of data than other entities would be in the public space. And second, because they're able to go ahead and do the link analysis at a very sophisticated level. So what we're thrilled at is this Global Cyber Alliance was initiated just in September, and the hope would that it would grow and that the market would respond. It's been really an overwhelming response to it because there's such a need for it. Mm-hmm. A safe space in a nonprofit sector that can link together private and public communities. Okay. And internationally, that's the key. If you're not linking London and New York as two leading financial sectors, as our criminals are moving money back and forth, you're not really doing a comprehensive job. Mm-hmm. So,
Vijay, do you see a role in that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add. I agree with everything Ken said.
Okay. If we have some time, I'd be open to taking some questions from the audience. We have someone coming around with a mic. We've got one up here in the third row. Oh, let's microphone.
Thank you. I saw on the news about facial recognition now being used as a form of security, your personal password. But how's that stored? And what happens to that data? My face being stored. Correct? I mean, this is a new talk now, and I want to know, because that's a security threat too.
It is. I don't know if you guys if you have comments on that. I do.
I think we should defer to you then.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, a facial match is not much different than any other biometric. How is it much different than your fingerprint, your retinal scan, etc.? That data can be stored and it can be matched against other systems of record. And I think as we start to progress more and more down this path of being able to look at your phone and log into your phone, or look at a computer screen and have you log into your computer screen, that information is going to be captured. So today, that's being most likely on these, I've seen this commercial, it's being stored on your local PC. But when you do a thumbprint scan, if you've ever done global entry, if you come into the United States and you put your 4 fingers down and it reads your fingerprints to get you quick access into the United States, that information is captured and it can be shared, and it's not much different than any of the other privacy-related data that you might have, whether it be your social security number, your date of birth, your address, your healthcare information. It's all about protecting that privacy and ensuring that there's policies and procedures in place. Yeah. It also is a very valuable tool for us as well to be able to predict and identify potential perpetrators in crime. We've got a gentleman over here.
A question for Ken. The notion of being proactive is intriguing. And maybe this just comes from a naive view of the legal process, but my understanding was that due process kind of sits at the foundation of enforcement work. And what's intriguing is the proactive approach. And I mean, I wonder what those challenges are. I wonder how the best practices that your organization has established can find their way into a broader forum so other organizations or enforcement organizations are taking heed and benefiting from that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me start by sort of integrating the two questions that happen. There's often an assumption or a thought that government, and I can only speak for my office, has a wealth of data about individuals that at its disposal. It's simply not the case. Our office can only have data that we're legally entitled to receive. So if there's an arrest that's made by a police officer or our office, there's sort of specific data that I can receive. Does the individual have a tattoo, the eye color, all this sort of stuff. There's other data that I am not permitted to receive and not permitted to integrate. So I just sort of want to make sure that people have a comfort level in knowing that, one, I don't want everyone's data because it's too much to deal with. I have to focus on what my market is, and what my market is criminal activity and criminal actors within New York. And they have to be ones who have properly come into our system. So I cannot do things like, I'm not stereotyping a particular group. That has nothing to do with what the data analytics of our office is. It's taking data that is lawfully within our possession and making sure it's communicating with each other. So for example, just basic things like a gang. Arrests were being made associated with a shooting in one particular building, and that might be assigned to one part of our office, and it wasn't being linked in any way to another arrest. Yet these criminals were actively talking to each other. All the analytics does is make sure that we know, hey, these two people are not operating independently. They're part of one coherent group. But it doesn't give me free right to any additional information that's not lawfully acquired. And I'll tell you, we operate in Manhattan. It is a strong, our judges protect suspects' rights vigilantly, as they should, and our office, we try to abide the same. The challenge is making sure that this balance is constantly being monitored. Because if we were to ever lose the public's trust as to what we're doing, right now we have the public's trust because we bring down gang activity. All the information related to that then has to be turned over to a defense counsel and a judge, so it's available for someone to digest. And that's really how we're different from an intelligence agency. So I hope I tried to, thank you, you're very welcome.
Do we have much more time for additional questions? I think we have two people here in the front that have been trying to ask a question. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. I had a question about the data restrictions associated with bringing in different data from, say, states or commercial vendors. How do you deal with all of that, since a lot of times different data sets, as you've shared, come with different restrictions, and you're trying to analyze it, and you're just would like your thoughts.
So I can speak for my office, of course. If you think of the data analytics work we do as a pot where we're putting data in, unless that data has been voluntarily provided by an entity, say a financial entity, attack data, cyber attack data that it doesn't involve any customer information, but is related to someone's IP address, all of that data, that's being voluntarily provided, or it's coming in via subpoena or search warrant. So the integration of that data and making sure that the proper balance is coming in, it's all ingredients that have to be pre-approved. And that's the way that we quality control what we're looking at. I don't know if that's a full answer or enough of an answer, but it's how we make sure that the streams of data, for example, I don't have access necessarily to federal data. If somebody's out there, unless I'm doing a joint operation with Secret Service, DHS, FBI, I'm not going to have direct access. And a judge has to approve that I'm able to share information from a state entity to a federal entity and vice versa for one specific investigation. So I just want people to have some comfort in knowing that a judge is overseeing the receipt of it, the framework of that data, and how we use the data. Because ultimately for us, it comes out in the wash. Is there a prosecution? It's a public event.
BJ, do you see that from an oversight perspective inside government?
I mean, we have fairly broad statutory access to federal data sources for our audit work. A lot of times we don't have so much specific issues with that. Now, there are some sensitive data sets that we negotiate agreements with federal agencies for about how we will use or reuse the data. And that's actually an evolving area, and that keeps our general counsel staff quite busy trying to work through the various implications of that. We contract for some commercial data sources, and at the time we contract for them, we review the license agreements and talk through internally how we would use or not use the data that we pay for. So it's just you have to do your due diligence at the outset when you get the data in.
That was a great question. I think that's wrapped it up for now. We're just about running over. Some of the speakers will be here. I'm sure you can catch us all after the segment here, and I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you very much, and have a great day.